If anyone ends up reading this, then it means I was successfully able to post it without it being taken down. Every other website and forum I've tried writing on has resulted in the same error notification being displayed, whether on a laptop or a smartphone. I can only assume it's something that the people in charge of whatever this is have done in order to prevent anyone left from getting word out about what's happened here, some kind of jamming device or scrambler. But, for whatever reason, this site still remains accessible, and so I'm posting this here, in a place that I don't think they'll ever check, because someone needs to know the truth. I'm pretty sure everyone knows about the test of the emergency broadcast system that happened earlier today. It was all over the internet and on the news yesterday. According to the smiling anchorman on our local channel, it would happen around 12:20 in the afternoon, and last for about a half an hour, broadcasting on television, radio, and to every cell phone turned on at that time. The town I live in, whose name I don't care to write in case anyone monitoring the internet is using a trolling program searching for specific names or phrases, only has a population of about 1,500 people. Because it's such a small and tight-knit community, conversations about the announcement began spreading like wildfire. Didn't they already do a test of the emergency system less than 3 years ago? Old Mrs. Kravitz asked the cashier at the grocery store while I stood in line behind her with a frozen pizza in my hands. I think I read something about how they're required to perform that test every 3 or 4 years, Lorna, she replied as she patiently waited for the elderly woman to finish writing out a check for her purchases. Later that night, after my parents had gone to bed, as I gorged myself on the remaining slices of pizza and watched reruns of I Love Lucy, I got a text from my friend Aubrey. "If I have to hear about this stupid test one more time, I think I'll scream," it said. I let out a small chuckle and typed back, "Yeah, you'd think with all the commotion over town that we're about to end up in a 21st century version of the Cuban Missile Crisis or something." After a few minutes, my phone vibrated in reply. "LOL, no joke. I was going to ask if you wanted to do some skateboarding tomorrow. We probably don't have much time left until the snow begins to fall." "Hell yes," I muttered quietly to myself, then typed out a reply. "I am absolutely down for that. I'll meet you in the parking lot of the diner at around 11:45. I hit send. Then a thought occurred to me. I sent a quick second text before she could respond. I'm going to turn my phone off tonight and leave it at home. I don't want to have to deal with that annoying tone going off. I took a sip of Coke and felt my eyes begin to droop. Sleep was calling my name. My phone buzzed. Good idea. I'll do the same. Gonna hit the sack. Catch you tomorrow. After bidding her good night as well, I held down the power button on the phone, the Samsung logo briefly showing before going to black. I reached for the remote and shut the TV off, dumping my dishes into the sink and heading upstairs, tossing the powered-down phone onto my desk. I set my alarm clock for 10 before climbing into bed, and quickly falling into a deep and dreamless sleep. In retrospect, turning off our phones and leaving them at home is probably what ended up saving our lives. At least, sparing us that horrible, initial fate anyways. In the morning, I quickly told my parents where I was heading, and after promising them that I'd be safe, I grabbed my skateboard, house keys, and jacket, and headed out the front door. The chilly, fall air smacked me in the face as I let gravity pull me down the residential streets towards downtown. Behind me, the Rocky Mountains rose imposing up into the sky, seeming like the turrets of a castle fortress. There's been a rumor going for close to 40-plus years that horror writer Dean Koontz once visited here in the late 70s, and ended up basing the fictional town of Snowfield on it for his novel Phantoms. I think it's a load of bull, though I can't deny that our town looks very similar to what the book described, so who knows. Looking left and right to watch out for any cars or trucks, I entered the town proper and made a beeline for the diner. Aubrey was leaning against the steps which led to the front door. "You're 5 minutes late, you know," she said jokingly, checking the watch on her wrist. "If I'd waited any longer, I would have had to organize a search party." I rolled my eyes at the lame joke and chuckled. "Bite me," I retorted good-naturedly, causing her to let out a laugh. "No thanks. I don't think I'd like the taste of you." This time, a full-blown laugh burst out of me, which set her off more. After a few seconds, we got control of ourselves again and straightened up. "So where do you want to go skate?" she asked me. I thought for a second, looking around. The diner was packed with patrons, having either lunch or a late breakfast, and the parking lot full of cars and trucks. Too risky to shred here. An idea came to me, and I snapped my fingers. "The old Blockbuster. It's got plenty of railings to grind, and we can kickflip over the parking lot bumps. Plus, since it's in the back of town, Sheriff Wake likely won't find us and force us to move." Aubrey rolled her eyes at the mention of the sheriff. The man had a major stick up his ass and seemingly hated everyone skateboarding, or, as he called it, creating a nuisance. Aubrey shrugged. "Sure, why not?" Our plan set, we tucked our boards under our arms and walked through town towards the abandoned building, which once housed the only video rental store in town. It took less than 5 minutes to reach it. The sign still stood at the entrance, the yellow letters long since having faded in the sun. I checked my own watch as Aubrey dropped her board onto the ground and pushed off. 12:05. The test was supposed to start in about 15 minutes. I shook my head, again glad we'd decided to ditch our phones for the day. For a brief moment, I remembered I'd forgotten to tell my folks I'd done so, and a small swath of guilt washed over me at the possibility they may end up worried if they tried to get a hold of me, but I pushed it out of my mind. I'd apologize when I got home. I dropped my own board to the ground and pushed off. For the next 10 to 12 minutes, the two of us whooped and laughed as we jumped and grinded our way across the parking lot. All the stress of having graduated and needing to pick a college to go to fell away from my mind, and I felt what I can only describe as peace. That peace was shattered by the sounds of tires screeching and steel and glass smashing against each other, reverberating off the buildings and seemingly off the mountains above us themselves. I'd been in the middle of grinding the entrance railing when it came, and it startled me so badly that I lost my balance, the board shooting out from under my feet as my hip smashed into the railing and I fell back to earth. I lay there for a moment, searing pain shooting through me before I felt a hand on my shoulder. "Damn, that was a nasty fall," Aubrey exclaimed. "Are you all right?" After deciding I hadn't broken any bones, I answered, "Yeah, I think so. It stings like a bitch, though." I looked up at her. "What the hell was that sound?" I asked. She shook her head, a similar confused expression on her face. "I don't know. It sounded like it came from back towards the main road." She looked around, then back at me. "I think it was a car crash." "My thoughts exactly," I muttered, pulling myself into a sitting position. Helping me to my feet, she motioned towards where the sound came from. "You want to go see?" she asked. After a moment's hesitation, I nodded. Tucking our boards back under our arms, we both hurried towards the road. Rounding the corner, we both immediately spied the devastation a few 100 feet ahead of us. "Holy," Aubrey breathed out. The intersection of Chestnut and Main Street looked like the aftermath of a destruction derby. 2 cars had collided almost head-on with one another, and what looked like a late 80s or early 90s Buick LeSabre and a brand-new Cadillac Escalade. With a sense of numbness surging through me, I realized I recognized both vehicles. The Cadillac belonged to Mr. Schultz, a rather wealthy but friendly man who rented out most of the houses he owned in town to the ski tourists that came to town every winter. The Buick belonged to Mrs. Kravitz, the old woman who I'd stood behind in the store yesterday. Smoke billowed out from both wrecks, and shattered glass and twists of metal littered the streets around them for hundreds of feet. "Oh my God," I said softly, echoing my friend's sentiments. We both exchanged a glance with each other, and then began running towards the accident. As we ran, a small part of the back of my mind noticed something which was so small but poignant. I don't see anyone else running out of the buildings. Everyone in town had to have heard it. Where are they? The train of thought was ripped away from me as we both skidded to a stop at the sight of the driver's door of the Cadillac being kicked open. An ear-piercing sound burst out of the SUV's interior, and I dropped my board and clapped my hands over my ears. From the corner of my eye, I saw Aubrey do the same. squeezing her eyes shut in pain and stumbling back into the side of the brick building next to us. Even through my hands, I could still hear the sound, though it was now slightly muffled. For a second, I couldn't place it, and then it hit me. It was the loud honking siren of the emergency alert system. But it sounded wrong. It was as if the tones had been warped and distorted into something else, and by the sound of it, Mr. Schultz had been listening to his car radio at full volume when they'd gone off. Speaking of which, a figure stumbled out of the SUV, grabbing onto the open door for support. Holy hell in a handbasket, Mr. Schultz survived that? I thought. I swung my gaze over to the Buick, squinting through the spiderweb of cracks that had become the windshield. I saw a small hint of movement. Then I saw Mrs. Kravitz lean back in her seat. She must have gashed her head open pretty badly, because her forehead was covered in blood. Keeping my hands over my ears to dull the still shrieking tone, I turned and got as close to Aubrey as I could so she could hear me through her hands and over the noise. "We've got to try and help them," I shouted as loud as I could. I could tell she understood me, as she nodded after a second. Then she looked backwards towards the wreck, and a look flashed across her face. A look I can still remember perfectly. First confusion, and then a clear expression of renewed horror. I felt a shiver shoot up my spine, and spun back around to look at what she'd seen. I truly wish I hadn't. Mr. Schultz was no longer next to his car. Instead, he'd run around to the driver's side of the Buick. For a split second, I thought it was to help her, until the screaming began. I didn't realize that an elderly woman could scream so high and shrill. The busted windshield prevented me from seeing exactly what Mr. Schultz was doing to Mrs. Kravitz, but it didn't prevent me from seeing the sudden fountain of blood which spurted out and coated the inside of the glass-like paint. The sight shocked me so much that I took my hands away from my ears and clamped them over my mouth to keep from screaming. It was then that I noticed the tone had stopped screeching, and silence had again settled over the town, but only for a few seconds. The sounds that sprang up, seemingly all over town, were almost somehow worse than the tone. They were the sounds of screaming. Yells and shrieks came from every conceivable direction. What I can only assume is what the depths of hell itself sound like. It was as if everyone in town were being brutally murdered at the exact same time. Almost as if it were a trigger, Mr. Schultz snapped his head up from where he'd been leaning into the car, and I saw that his eyes had gone completely red. It was as if all the capillaries in his eyes had burst. He reached back into the car and pulled something out. With a sickening churn of my stomach, I saw it was a sharp shard of broken glass, one edge dripping still fresh blood from it. Without even looking in our direction, he took off back towards the heart of downtown in a sprint, almost in the manner of a child rushing to join the frolicking and fun of his friends at an amusement park. For a few moments, neither of us said anything, simply standing there in dumbstruck horror like deer in the headlights. Finally, Aubrey spoke up, her voice shaky. "What the absolute fuck just happened?" she managed out. I could only shake my head. The cries of terror and what almost sounded like rage still coming from around the corner. She spoke again. He killed her. Mrs. Kravitz. He butchered her like a cow in a slaughterhouse. Eddie, what the Her voice rose into a scream as she finished. I turned and clamped a hand over her mouth, afraid that her shriek would bring Mr. Schultz back to us. I put a finger to my lips, and after a second she nodded. Pulling my hand away, she spoke softer. "Eddie, what the hell is happening?" I shook my head, finally managing to find my voice. I don't know." She looked back towards the main road. "We need to get back home, now." I nodded. "Agreed, but we can't blindly run out into the main road, not with—" I gestured towards the hellish sounds coming from the direction we needed to go. "Whatever the hell is happening going on?" A look of realization crossed her face. "The alleyways!" she exclaimed, causing me to remember the maze of alleyways that crisscrossed between the Main Street buildings. "All right, but first, let's see exactly what the hell is going on." She hesitated, but nodded. Motioning to be quiet, I led the way to the corner of the building on one side of the intersection. "Just let me look around the corner quickly," I whispered. Again, she nodded silently. Taking a deep breath, I peered around the corner onto the main street. If I hadn't already been in shock, I don't think I would have been able to keep from screaming at the grisly sight that awaited me. It was like the scene out of a horror movie. People were dashing around from building to building, clutching all sorts of things, crutches, kitchen knives. There was even one man wielding what looked like an old sword which had hung inside the antique shop. That wasn't the horrifying sight. There were dozens of bodies littering Main Street. It seemed people had dashed out of everywhere, the diner, grocery store, and hardware store, and more. Blood pooled around their still forms. Still others, some holding their arms or stomach to stop the bleeding, were attempting to run away from those wielding weapons. They didn't make it very far, though, as they were overwhelmed by the others. They all shouted and screamed in what sounded like a total and complete rage as they chased them down. "Fuck me," was all I could whisper out. I pulled my head back, and the look on my face must have told Aubrey all she needed to know. Her face had gone pale as a sheet. "That bad?" she asked. I just nodded. I could see the cogs turning in her head. "Okay, we need to stick to the plan. We use the alleys, get through downtown, and get back to our houses." I felt a wave of gratitude pass over me. She was managing to hold her composure better than I could have hoped for. I nodded, and following her, we slipped into the gloomy shade of the alley that ran behind the buildings on the right side of the street. We made our way carefully through them, making sure not to attract any attention from the hell still erupting on the main drag, but we saw little glimpses every time we reached a T-junction. We both saw people we'd known all our lives inflicting violence upon each other, so shocking and vile, I can't bring myself to write it down. I would lose what little sanity remains in my head if I did. We made it to the back parking lot of the diner we'd initially met up in, and stopped to wait. The sound of gunshots blasting out caused both of us to freeze and duck back into the alley to hide, and not a moment too soon either, because we saw the sheriff's Ford Explorer fly down the road. Sheriff Wake was leaning out of the window, using one hand to steer while firing his pistol with the other. I only saw his face for a moment, but it was enough to see the crazed look there as the others had. The sound of the roaring engine faded, along with the gunshots after a few seconds, but we could still hear the screeching tires echoing all over the chaos. Aubrey turned to look at me, an almost hopeless look on her face. "Eddie, what the hell do we do?" she asked weakly. I knelt and thought, hard and fast. We can't stay outside much longer. We stay out here, we're dead. We need to find shelter, at least for a little while. I spoke. "We need to find a place to lie low for a little while, until we know we can make it safely back to the other side of town." Her face turned into a mask of panic. "But what about our parents?" I felt a knot tie itself in my stomach. The thought of my mom and dad caught up in this hell, without a way to get a hold of me, threatened to overwhelm me, but I kept as level ahead as I could. "We're not going to be able to help them if we end up like the others," I said as calmly as possible. "There's too many people all over the place to avoid all the way back. We need to find some place not many people would have been at, and hunker down until we think it's safe enough to keep going." She looked like she wanted to argue, but nodded after a few moments. Then she looked at me. "The library," she said simply. "Not many people besides the adults go there anymore. It's right on the other side of this building." She pointed at the brick apartments that made up the far side of the alley. I nodded. "Okay, let's wait a second, then go." She nodded, and after not seeing anyone for a minute, we began to move from car to car in the parking lot, using them as cover to reach the street. I looked towards the diner. The inside of the windows I could see were splashed with blood, evidence of the slaughter that must have taken place inside. I also noticed, with a vague air of surprise, that the ground in the diner's parking lot seemed to be littered with smartphones. The screens from many were still lit up, and as I stepped over one, I glanced down to see the notice flashing up at me. "Test alert. This is a test of the National Wireless Emergency Alert System. No action is needed." As I read it, a sound snapped my head up. It was the sound of static from a radio, coming from a few cars up. Sharing a look of panic with Aubrey, and convinced the sound would draw unwanted attention our way, we hurried down the line towards the sound. It was coming from a red YJ Wrangler, one which I recognized belonged to Mr. and Mrs. Nolte, two survivalists who lived farther up in the mountains, but came down into town to buy supplies and sometimes eat at the diner. Scrambling to the passenger door, I yanked on the handle, praying for it to be unlocked. The door mercifully opened, and with a last look around, I practically flew into the passenger seat. The crackling sound was coming from an old CB radio mounted under the dash, and I reached out to shut it off. That was when the crackling sound changed to the smooth sound of a man's voice.
"Sir, all entrance and exits to the town have been cordoned off and sentries placed to make sure no one enters or leaves. The satellite feed should be up in about 30 minutes, and the jammer will be up in 10.
Another man's voice answered him, this one deep and authoritative.
"Very good, Deacons. RF Ultra Phase 1 is now a go. Maintain radio silence for the next 12 hours.
The first voice spoke again.
"Roger that, sir. Over and out."
And with that, the radio died, now not even belting out static. I shot a look out the open door at Aubrey, who gave me a similar look of shock and confusion. Was this happening intentionally? Did someone cause this? I didn't stop to wonder beyond that, though. Climbing back out of the Jeep, I softly closed the door and motioned for her to keep moving. Making sure that nobody was near us, we stayed hunched over and made a mad dash for the library. That's where we've been ever since. We got inside and barricaded the front door with some benches which were inside the foyer. Aside from, to our horror, the body of Mrs. Thatch, the librarian, it was thankfully empty. I went and found an old drop cloth in a closet and draped it over her. I couldn't stand to see what someone had done to the back of her skull with what looked like a pipe or wrench. The sounds of our fellow townsfolk slaughtering each other barely let up for the last few hours, but as the sun began to set, it slowly turned silent. I don't know whether that's because the carnage had stopped for now, or everyone who hasn't gone insane is dead. I don't dare think about that, though. The idea that my parents, as well as Aubrey's, along with all our friends, are either lying in a pool of blood somewhere, or is slinking through the shadows looking for us, is too much to bear. We still hear the roar of the sheriff's cruiser roaming around downtown, though. After some thought, and with night coming fast, we decided to stay here for the night. In the morning, if it's safe, we'll take down our barricade and try and make it back to the residential side of town. In the meantime, I tried both the landline telephone and the computers connected to the internet. Neither one of them worked. The only thing that did, which I'm using to type this now, is a laptop that seems to have a satellite connection. Whoever those people are, they must not have thought anyone in town had a satellite link up. It's still spotty, as I said at the start, though. No social media sites such as Facebook or Twitter load, and neither does YouTube. Email doesn't work, but for whatever reason, Reddit seems to. And so, in the darkness of the library's break room, I type this out. I pray to God that it successfully posts and that someone will see it. If you do, please, tell me what Aubrey and I should do. Anything that might help us to survive. I'll check it in the morning, before we head out. If you have any idea what those men on the radio were talking about whatever RF Ultra is, please tell me, because I can't understand what is happening, or why. And if they haven't blocked access entirely, I'll try and make another post tomorrow to let you know we're still alive. For now, I need to try and get some sleep, if that's even possible. If I don't post, you'll know we didn't make it.